Water has its own language, and David Martinez had been learning its vocabulary for 17 years without realizing it. There was the gentle percussion of rain against windows that meant safety, the rhythmic drip from the bathroom faucet that meant minor annoyance, the gurgle of pipes settling that meant home. And then there was this sound, the angry hiss of water escaping where it wasn't supposed to be, the sound water makes when it's winning and you're not. At 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, David woke to the sound of victory. Not his victory, the water's. The basement apartment he shared with his 9-year-old sister Sophie had always been damp, but damp was different from flooded. Damp meant wiping condensation off windows and running a dehumidifier that sounded like an old man clearing his throat. Flooded meant wading through ankle-deep water in his boxers, searching for the source of a leak that had turned their living room carpet into a sponge. "David?" Sophie's voice came from her bedroom, small and careful in the way that meant she'd been awake but trying not to be a problem. "There's water." "I know, Soph. Stay on your bed. Don't get down." David found the burst pipe behind the water heater, a split in the copper that sprayed water with the enthusiasm of a broken sprinkler. He turned off the main water valve with a wrench their landlord had left behind 6 months ago, back when he'd still pretended to care about maintenance requests. The water stopped flowing, but the damage was done. Their apartment had become a shallow lake. Sophie appeared in her doorway, standing on her bed in pajamas covered with unicorns, holding her doll like a life preserver. "Are we sinking?" "We're not sinking," David said, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "We're just taking on water, like a boat." "Can boats live in basements?" "This one can." David looked around their flooded apartment and did the math that had become second nature since their mother died 18 months ago and left him to be Sophie's guardian without the legal paperwork to make it official. Emergency plumber, $300 they didn't have. Water damage repair, probably $1,000 they definitely didn't have. Landlord who would demand they move out, priceless in the worst possible way. Or option 2, fix it themselves and hope nobody noticed that 2 minors were living alone in a basement that occasionally tried to become an aquarium. David waded to the kitchen and grabbed every towel, blanket, and absorbent fabric he could find. "Soph, we're going to play a game. It's called Don't Let the Water Win. You're going to be my assistant." "What do I do?" "You're going to sit right there on the counter and tell me I'm the best brother in the world while I save our house from turning into a swimming pool." Sophie giggled, which was the sound David needed to hear to remember that this was just another problem to solve, not the end of the world. He'd been solving problems for 18 months. He could solve this one too. Midnight maintenance. The water heater sat in the corner like a guilty confession, surrounded by the evidence of its betrayal. David had watched YouTube videos about plumbing repairs during lunch breaks at school, the same way other teenagers watched videos about video games or makeup tutorials. When you're 17 and responsible for keeping a 9-year-old alive without any adults knowing about it, you learn practical skills faster than you learn algebra. He wrapped the burst pipe with electrical tape and a section of rubber hose, creating a bandage that looked like it was held together by hope and stubbornness. The repair wouldn't pass any inspection, but it would hold long enough for him to figure out a permanent solution that didn't involve calling someone who would ask questions about where their parents were. "You're really good at fixing things," Sophie said from her perch on the kitchen counter, swinging her legs in the rhythm of someone who trusted completely that her brother could fix anything that broke. "I'm really good at YouTube," David corrected, testing his repair by turning the water back on. The pipe held. The spray stopped. The immediate crisis became merely a medium-sized disaster. Sophie watched him work with the concentration of someone studying for a test she didn't want to fail. She'd been doing that since their mother died, paying attention to everything David did, learning the routine of their life together, memorizing the rules that kept them safe and together. "Are we going to tell Mrs. Chen upstairs?" Sophie asked. Mrs. Chen was their neighbor, an elderly woman who brought them soup when she thought they looked thin and asked gentle questions about their parents that David answered with carefully constructed lies. She was kind, which made her dangerous, because kind people were the ones most likely to call social services if they suspected 2 children were living alone. "We're not going to tell anyone," David said, wringing out a towel that had absorbed approximately its own weight in water. "This is our problem, and we're going to solve it ourselves. Like always." Like always, David had been solving their problems himself since the morning he'd woken up to find their mother cold in her bed. 3 empty pill bottles on the nightstand, and a note that apologized for everything except leaving them alone. He'd been 15 then, Sophie 7, and the foster care system had seemed like a threat rather than a safety net. So he'd made different choices. He'd buried their mother quietly, told the few people who asked that she'd moved to Phoenix for work, and that their grandmother was taking care of them. He'd forged signatures on school forms, paid bills with money from their mother's life insurance, and learned to be a parent before he'd finished being a child. It had worked for 18 months. Sophie was healthy, happy, and performing well in school. David was managing to stay caught up in his classes while working a night job at a warehouse. They had a routine, a budget, and a life that functioned as long as nobody looked too closely. But a flooded basement was the kind of crisis that attracted attention, and attention was the one thing David couldn't afford. The decision that changed everything. By 4 a.m., David had moved everything salvageable to higher ground. Their couch sat on cinder blocks he'd found in the alley, creating an island in the middle of their living room. Sophie's bed was elevated on stacks of textbooks, turning her bedroom into a fort built for survival rather than fun. The carpet squelched under their feet like a sponge that had given up on being dry. "Can we still live here?" Sophie asked, standing in the doorway of their transformed apartment. David looked around at the water damage, the makeshift furniture arrangements, and the evidence of a home that was fighting a losing battle against the laws of physics and gravity. "We can live anywhere," he said. "The question is whether we should." But they both knew the real question was whether they had anywhere else to go. The answer was no, which made the decision easier and harder at the same time. "I'm going to call Mr. Henderson," David said, referring to their landlord. "I'm going to tell him about the pipe, and I'm going to ask him to fix it properly. What if he says we have to move? Then we move." Sophie nodded with the solemn acceptance of someone who had learned that homes were temporary, but family was portable. "Will we move together?" The question hit David in the chest like a physical blow, because it was the question that lived underneath all their other questions. Would they move together? Would they stay together? Would anyone discover that they'd been living alone and decide that Sophie belonged with a real family, instead of with a brother who was doing his best, but wasn't technically an adult? "We'll stay together," David promised, though he had no idea how to guarantee that promise if their current situation collapsed. At 7 a.m., David called their landlord from the payphone outside the laundromat, because their apartment phone had been on a table that was now underwater. Mr. Henderson answered on the 4th ring, sounding like a man who'd been woken up by problems he didn't want to solve. "The pipe burst," David explained, "behind the water heater. I turned off the water and did a temporary repair, but it needs to be fixed properly." "How much water?" "A few inches throughout the apartment." Henderson was quiet for a moment, calculating the cost of repairs against the rent they paid, and probably deciding that eviction was cheaper than plumbing. "I'll send someone to look at it this afternoon. Don't use any water until I tell you it's safe." "What about in the meantime? The apartment's flooded." "Figure it out, kid. That's what tenants do." The line went dead. David stood in the November cold, holding a phone that buzzed with dial tone, and realized that their landlord's solution to a burst pipe was the same as his solution to most problems. Ignore it, and hope it went away. David walked back to their basement apartment where Sophie was eating cereal with water from a bottle they kept for emergencies, sitting on their elevated couch like a castaway who'd made peace with being stranded. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said we should figure it out." "Good thing you already did." David looked at his sister, 9 years old, eating breakfast in a flooded basement, trusting completely that her brother would keep her safe and housed and fed, and made the decision that would change everything. He was going to fix this properly, not with tape and hope, but with real materials and real skills. He was going to turn their flooded basement into a home again, and he was going to do it without asking for help that came with questions they couldn't answer. Neighbors who see too much. The hardware store opened at 8, and David was waiting outside with a list written on notebook paper and a budget calculated in the margins. Copper pipe, flux, solder, torch rental, pipe cutter, and prayer that $37 would be enough to perform a miracle. The clerk was a man in his 50s who looked at David's list with the expression of someone who had learned not to judge customers by their age or their confidence level. "You know how to solder." "Pipe? I'm about to learn." "YouTube?" "YouTube." The man nodded approvingly. "YouTube taught me how to fix my transmission." Good luck, kid. David walked home with supplies that felt heavier than their combined weight, because they represented the difference between solving their problem and having their problem solve them. Sophie met him at the apartment door, dressed for school and holding her backpack like a shield against the uncertainty of leaving their flooded home for 8 hours. You're really going to fix it today? I'm really going to try. What if you can't? David knelt down to Sophie's eye level, balancing his bag of plumbing supplies against his knee. Soph, I need you to understand something. We've been taking care of each other for 18 months. We've figured out grocery shopping and bill paying and parent-teacher conferences and how to make mac and cheese taste like a real dinner. We can figure out a pipe. Sophie hugged him with the fierce intensity of someone saying goodbye before a dangerous mission. Don't flood the house while I'm at school. I'll try to keep the flooding to a minimum. After Sophie left for school, David spread his supplies on the kitchen counter and watched 3 YouTube videos about soldering copper pipe. The process looked straightforward in the videos. Clean the pipe, apply flux, heat the joint, apply solder. What the videos didn't explain was how to perform precision metalwork while standing ankle-deep in cold water, in a basement that smelled like wet carpet and desperation. He was cutting the damaged section of pipe when Mrs. Chen knocked on their door. David, are you all right down there? I heard water running for hours last night. David froze, holding a pipe cutter and wearing clothes that were damp with floodwater and evidence of crisis management. Mrs. Chen was kind, but kindness was dangerous when it came with the potential for phone calls to authorities who would ask questions about guardianship and living situations. Everything's fine, Mrs. Chen, just a small leak. I'm fixing it now. Do you need help? My nephew is a plumber. That's very generous, but I've got it under control. There was a pause, the kind of pause that meant Mrs. Chen was processing the gap between small leak and the sound of running water that had lasted until dawn. Where are your parents, David? The question he'd been dreading for 18 months, asked through a door by someone who cared enough to be suspicious. David looked around their flooded apartment, at his plumbing supplies, at the evidence of a teenager trying to perform adult responsibilities without adult supervision. They're at work, he said, which was true in the same way that all his lies were true. Technically accurate, but missing the crucial detail that their mother's work was being dead and their father's work was being absent. I haven't seen them in weeks. They work long hours. Another pause. David, if you need help. We don't need help, Mrs. Chen, but thank you. David listened to her footsteps retreating up the stairs and realized that their neighbors were starting to notice the gaps in their story. Mrs. Chen might not call social services today, but if she kept seeing signs that 2 minors were living alone, she might eventually decide that helping them meant making phone calls they couldn't afford to receive. He turned back to his pipe repair with new urgency. The faster he fixed their apartment, the faster their life could return to the careful normal that kept them safe and together. Papers that don't tell the whole truth. The soldering went better than David had expected, and worse than he'd hoped. The joint held, the water flowed, and the immediate crisis was resolved. But the water damage remained. Warped floorboards, stained walls, and the persistent smell of damp that would take weeks to fade completely. David spent the afternoon moving furniture back to its proper places and aiming box, fans at the wet spots, creating a domestic wind tunnel that turned their basement into a noisy but functional home. By the time Sophie returned from school, their apartment looked almost normal, if you didn't mind the industrial humming of 4 box fans and the occasional squish of water in the carpet. You did it, Sophie said, dropping her backpack and spinning in their living room like she was celebrating the successful completion of a space mission. We did it, David corrected. Team effort. Sophie examined his pipe repair with the seriousness of a building inspector. It looks very professional. It looks like something that will hold until we can afford to have it done right. They celebrated with pizza delivery paid for, with the money David had been saving for Sophie's winter coat. Priorities were fluid when you were managing a household on a teenager's wages, and a successful plumbing repair seemed worth the temporary sacrifice of forward planning. After dinner, David helped Sophie with homework while simultaneously researching water damage restoration techniques on his laptop. Sophie worked on multiplication tables, while David learned about mold prevention and the importance of thorough drying. They sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by the sound of fans and the smell of damp, doing the work that kept their life functioning. David, Sophie said, looking up from her math worksheet, are we poor? It was the question that lived underneath most of their other questions, the one David had been hoping she wouldn't ask directly. They weren't poor in the sense of being homeless or hungry, but they were poor in the sense of living paycheck to paycheck and making choices between necessities. "We're managing," David said. "Why?" "Rebecca at school said poor kids get free lunch, but I buy lunch with the money you give me. So I was wondering if we're poor or if we're just careful with money." David looked at his sister, who was trying to categorize their financial situation with the logical precision of a 9-year-old who had learned that understanding problems was the first step toward solving them. "We're careful with money," he said, "because we have to be. But we're not poor in any way that matters." "What ways matter?" "Poor in love, poor in family, poor in people who care about each other. We're rich in all the ways that count." Sophie nodded and returned to her multiplication tables, satisfied with an answer that was true even if it wasn't complete. David watched her work and thought about the mathematics of their situation. 18 months of successful guardianship, but no legal authority to make it permanent. A functioning household, but no official recognition that he was capable of providing it. A family, but no paperwork to prove it existed. Their doorbell rang at 8:30, which was unusual because they rarely had visitors and never had visitors that late. David looked through the peephole and saw a woman in a business suit holding a clipboard, and his stomach dropped because he recognized the uniform of someone whose job was to ask questions he couldn't answer honestly. "Mr. Martinez?" the woman said when David opened the door. "I'm Linda Santos from Child Protective Services. I received a report of minors living without adult supervision at this address. The social worker's visit." Linda Santos was younger than David had expected, maybe 30, with the kind of calm professionalism that suggested she'd learned to deliver difficult news without making it sound like the end of the world. She wore a badge that said her job was to protect children, which made David wonder what she would think when she discovered that the children she was supposed to protect had been doing a pretty good job of protecting themselves. "There's been some mistake," David said, blocking the doorway with his body in a way that he hoped looked casual rather than defensive. "Our parents are here. Are they available to speak with me?" David's mind raced through possible responses. He could lie and say his parents were asleep. He could lie and say they were at the store. He could lie and say they were sick. But lies had expiration dates, and Linda Santos looked like someone who would return with follow-up questions. "They're not available right now," he said, which was true in every sense that mattered. "When would be a good time to schedule an appointment?" "What is this about exactly?" Linda Santos consulted her clipboard like it held a script for conversations that went sideways. "We received a report that 2 minors have been living alone in this apartment. I need to verify that appropriate adult supervision is present." David felt Sophie appear behind him, drawn by the sound of voices and the instinct to stay close when strangers asked questions about their family. She pressed against his back like a small, warm reminder of what was at stake. "Who reported that?" David asked. "I can't share that information, but I can tell you that the report expressed concern for the welfare of the children in this household." Linda Santos looked past David to Sophie, who was trying to make herself invisible while simultaneously listening to every word. "Hi there. What's your name?" Sophie looked up at David, asking permission with her eyes. He nodded slightly because refusing to let a social worker talk to Sophie would create more suspicion than allowing a brief conversation. "Sophie," she said quietly. "Sophie, do you live here with your parents?" Sophie's pause was barely noticeable, but David felt it like a physical weight. She was 9 years old and being asked to lie to an adult whose job was to help children, and she was smart enough to understand that the wrong answer could change everything. "I live here with my family," Sophie said finally, which was true and careful and exactly the kind of answer David had taught her to give when strangers asked complicated questions. Linda Santos made notes on her clipboard that David couldn't read upside down but assumed were not complimentary. "I need to speak with your parents," she told David. "Today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest. They're working late shifts this week," David said. "But I can have them call you. Mr. Martinez, I'm required to complete a home visit within 24 hours of receiving a report. If your parents aren't available by tomorrow evening, I'll need to return with additional resources to ensure the children's safety." Additional resources. David understood that was bureaucratic language for police officers and emergency custody and the kind of intervention that would separate him from Sophie permanently. They'll be here tomorrow, David said. What time works for you? 7 p.m. I'll need to speak with both parents and conduct a brief home inspection. After Linda Santos left, David and Sophie stood in their living room surrounded by the sound of box fans and the weight of an impossible deadline. 24 hours to produce parents who didn't exist. Are we in trouble? Sophie asked. David looked at his sister, 9 years old, trusting, completely dependent on his ability to solve problems that were getting bigger than his capacity to handle them, and realized that they'd reached the point where all his careful planning and responsible management might not be enough to keep them together. We're going to figure this out, he said, though he had no idea how. When help becomes harm, David stayed awake all night researching emergency guardianship laws on his laptop. The legal requirements were clear and impossible. He needed to be 18 to petition for custody of Sophie, needed documented proof of their parents' inability to provide care, needed character references from adults who could vouch for his fitness as a guardian. He was 17, had no legal proof that their mother was dead because he'd never reported her death, and the only adults who knew him well were teachers who would be required to report suspected child neglect to the authorities. The mathematics of their situation had finally produced an equation he couldn't solve. At 6 a.m., David made coffee and called in sick to work because attending his warehouse job seemed less important than figuring out how to keep his family intact. Sophie woke up to find him at the kitchen table surrounded by printouts of legal documents and custody requirements, looking like someone who had been awake all night calculating impossible odds. "Did you find a solution?" she asked, settling beside him with a bowl of cereal. "I'm working on it." Sophie read over his shoulder, sounding out legal words she didn't understand. "What's emergency custody?" "It's what happens when kids need a safe place to live and their parents can't provide it." "Would I get a safe place to live?" David looked at his sister, who was asking the question that cut to the heart of everything. Would she get a safe place to live if Linda Santos discovered they'd been living alone? Probably. Would it be with him? Probably not. "You already have a safe place to live," David said. "Here, with me. But the law doesn't think so. The law doesn't know us." Sophie finished her cereal and rinsed her bowl with the careful attention of someone who understood that maintaining routines was important even when everything else was falling apart. "What if we told the truth?" "What do you mean?" "What if we told the social worker lady that Mom died and you've been taking care of me and we're doing fine? Maybe she would let us stay together." David considered this with the desperation of someone who had run out of better options. Telling the truth would mean admitting that he'd been living as Sophie's unauthorized guardian for 18 months. It would mean explaining why he'd never reported their mother's death, never sought official custody, never asked for help from the system designed to protect children in their situation. The truth might lead to understanding and support, or it might lead to Sophie being placed in foster care while David faced charges for failing to report a death and providing false information to school officials and social services. The truth is risky, Soph. Lying is risky too. Sophie was right, which was the most frustrating part of being responsible for someone smarter than you were. Lying to Linda Santos would require producing parents who didn't exist. Telling the truth would require trusting that a social worker would see 18 months of successful caregiving and decide that keeping them together was more important than following protocol. David looked around their apartment, still damp from the flood, but clean and organized and obviously home to people who cared about maintaining it. Sophie's artwork covered the refrigerator. Her school books were stacked neatly on the counter. The emergency supplies David had accumulated were organized in labeled containers under the sink. Their home looked like a place where children were loved and supervised, even if the supervisor was technically still a child himself. "If we tell the truth," David said, "we have to tell all of it. About Mom, about the last 18 months, about everything. Will you get in trouble?" "I might." Sophie thought about this with the seriousness of someone weighing options that would affect both of them. "Will I get in trouble?" "No. You were 7 when Mom died. You didn't make any of the decisions. But I agreed with them. I wanted to stay with you instead of going to foster care." David felt something shift in his chest. Pride and terror and love so fierce it made him understand why people made impossible promises to protect the people they couldn't bear to lose. "We'll tell the truth," he decided. "We'll tell Linda Santos everything, and we'll trust that she cares more about keeping families together than about following rules that don't." account for situations like ours. At 6:45 p.m., David and Sophie sat on their couch waiting for Linda Santos to return. David had prepared a folder of documents. Sophie's school records showing perfect attendance and good grades, his own school transcripts and employment records, bank statements showing consistent bill payments, and medical records proving that Sophie had received regular checkups and vaccinations. He'd also written a letter explaining their situation, their mother's death, his decision to care for Sophie independently, the routines and systems he'd developed to ensure her safety and well-being. The letter was 3 pages long and read like a legal brief written by someone defending the most important case of his life. When Linda Santos knocked, David answered the door with his folder of evidence and the kind of nervous courage that came from knowing you were about to risk everything on the hope that honesty would be enough. The weight we carry together. Linda Santos accepted David's invitation to sit at their kitchen table, where she spread her paperwork and David spread his evidence like competing lawyers preparing for a trial that would determine Sophie's future. Sophie sat between them, holding her doll, and watching the adults who were deciding whether she got to keep her brother or got assigned to strangers. "Mr. Martinez," Linda Santos began, "I need to speak with your parents before we can proceed." "Miss Santos," David interrupted, "I need to tell you something that's going to change this conversation." He slid his letter across the table and watched Linda Santos read it with the careful attention of someone who had learned that the truth was usually more complicated than the reports that crossed her desk. Her expression shifted as she read. Surprise, concern, calculation, and something that might have been admiration for a teenager who had managed to successfully parent a 9-year-old for 18 months without any official support. When she finished reading, Linda Santos set the letter down and looked at David with the kind of direct gaze that meant the conversation had moved beyond protocol and into the territory of human judgment. "Your mother died 18 months ago, and you've been caring for Sophie independently since then." "Yes." "Why didn't you contact Child Protective Services when your mother died?" David had anticipated this question, but that didn't make it easier to answer. "Because I was afraid you'd separate us. Sophie had already lost her mother. I didn't want her to lose her brother too. You were 15 years old, you were a child yourself. I was a child who was capable of taking care of another child, and I was right to be afraid, wasn't I? If I'd called CPS when Mom died, Sophie would be in foster care right now, and I'd be in a different foster home, and we'd be visiting each other on weekends if we were lucky." Linda Santos made notes that David couldn't read, but her handwriting looked thoughtful rather than condemning. "Tell me about your current living situation. How do you support yourselves financially?" David opened his folder and produced bank statements, pay stubs from his warehouse job, and a budget spreadsheet that showed how he managed their household expenses on his part-time income, supplemented by their mother's life insurance money. "I work 20 hours a week at Morrison Warehouse. I maintain a 3.4 GPA at school. Sophie attends Lincoln Elementary, where she's an honor roll student with perfect attendance. We have health insurance through the state program for low-income families." "Who supervises Sophie while you're at work?" "Mrs. Chen upstairs watches her in the evenings when I'm at the warehouse. During the day she's at school or at the after-school program. I'm always home by midnight." Linda Santos reviewed his documentation with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to look for evidence of neglect and was instead finding evidence of competent caregiving. "Mr. Martinez, what you've accomplished is remarkable, but it's also illegal. You don't have legal custody of Sophie. You've been forging signatures on school documents. You failed to report your mother's death. I know. The standard protocol in this situation would be to place Sophie in emergency foster care while we sort out legal guardianship issues." David felt Sophie's hand find his under the table, small fingers gripping tight with the understanding that this was the moment when their family either survived or didn't. "Ms. Santos," David said, "Sophie isn't being neglected. She's being loved and cared for by someone who would do anything to keep her safe. I know I don't have legal custody, but I have something more important than paperwork. I have 18 months of proof that I can be her guardian in every way that matters." Linda Santos closed her folder and looked at Sophie, who had been listening to adults discuss her future with the careful attention of someone who understood that her opinion might matter. "Sophie," Linda Santos said gently, "how do you feel about living with your brother?" Sophie looked at David, then back at Linda Santos, and David realized she was about to give testimony that would determine whether they got to stay together. "David takes good care of me," Sophie said, with the seriousness of someone much older than 9. He makes sure I eat vegetables and do my homework and brush my teeth. He reads to me at night and helps me with math problems and never misses parent-teacher conferences. He's not just my brother. He's my family. What would you want to happen now? I want to stay with David. He's the best guardian I could have, even if he's not old enough to be official about it. Linda Santos made more notes, and David tried to read her expression for clues about whether Sophie's testimony was helping or hurting their case. After several minutes of writing, she looked up with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested she was about to deliver news that was complicated, rather than simply good or bad. "Here's what I'm going to recommend," she said. "Emergency kinship placement with David as temporary guardian, supervised by this department, with a court hearing scheduled within 30 days to determine permanent custody arrangements." David felt relief flood his chest so suddenly that he had to concentrate on breathing steadily. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means Sophie stays with you while we navigate the legal process of making your guardianship official. It means you'll have social worker visits twice a month to ensure stability and well-being. It means you'll need to complete parenting classes and financial planning workshops to demonstrate your readiness for legal guardianship. And if I complete all of that, then we petition the court to grant you full custody when you turn 18 in 4 months. The judge will consider the evidence of successful caregiving, Sophie's preference to remain with you, and our department's recommendation based on our supervision period." Sophie squeezed David's hand with the excitement of someone who had just learned that her family was going to stay intact. David squeezed back, overwhelmed with gratitude for a social worker who had chosen to see competent caregiving instead of technical violations. "There's one more thing," Linda Santos said. "I need to ask about the flood damage I noticed when I walked in. Have you reported the plumbing issues to your landlord?" David explained the burst pipe, his temporary repair, and their landlord's indifference to maintenance issues. Linda Santos listened with the expression of someone adding housing conditions to her growing file of concerns that needed addressing. "Substandard housing could affect the custody determination," she said. "I'll need to document the repairs and your landlord's response as part of our supervision file. Are you going to recommend that we move?" "I'm going to recommend that you have safe, appropriate housing. Whether that means repairs to this apartment or relocation to a better situation will depend on what your landlord does about the water damage. A home that holds water and love." 3 weeks later, their apartment was officially dry. David had used his employee discount at the warehouse to buy a dehumidifier that ran constantly, pulling moisture from the air with the persistence of someone who understood that mold prevention was a matter of keeping custody rather than just maintaining property. The court hearing was scheduled for December 15th, 2 weeks before David's 18th birthday. Linda Santos visited twice a week, documenting their routines and Sophie's continued well-being, and David's progress in the parenting classes that taught him skills he'd already learned through 18 months of trial and error. The classes were useful in unexpected ways. David learned about child development and educational support and the importance of maintaining connections with extended family, which prompted him to contact their mother's sister in Colorado, who had lost touch after the funeral. Aunt Maria cried when David called to explain their situation, and she cried harder when Sophie got on the phone and told her about school and her brother, and the life they'd built together in a basement apartment that sometimes flooded but always felt like home. "Why didn't you call me when your mother died?" Aunt Maria asked. "Because I was afraid you'd want to take Sophie to live with you in Colorado, and I couldn't bear to lose her too. David, I would have wanted what was best for both of you, and from what you're telling me, what was best was staying together." Aunt Maria agreed to attend their custody hearing as a character witness, providing the family support that the court needed to see as evidence that David wasn't completely alone in his guardianship responsibilities. Mr. Henderson, their landlord, responded to Linda Santos's official inquiry about housing conditions by hiring a contractor to replace the water heater, repair the water damage, and install a sump pump to prevent future flooding. The improvements were probably motivated more by fear of housing code violations than concern for tenant welfare, but the result was the same. Their apartment became genuinely safe and dry for the first time since they'd moved in. On the morning of the custody hearing, David wore a suit he'd bought at Goodwill, and Sophie wore a dress that Aunt Maria had sent from Colorado. They sat in the courthouse waiting room with Linda Santos and Jonah Klein, the legal aid attorney who had agreed to represent David's petition for guardianship. "How do you feel?" Sophie asked, swinging her legs from the chair that was too big for her. "Like I'm about to take the most important test of my life. You'll pass. You always figure out how to solve problems." When their case was called, they entered a courtroom that smelled like wood polish and serious decisions. Judge Patricia Walsh presided from behind a bench that made her look both authoritative and kind, which David hoped was a good combination for someone deciding whether a 17-year-old could officially parent a 9-year-old. Linda Santos testified about her supervision visits, David's completion of parenting classes, and Sophie's continued academic success and emotional stability. Aunt Maria testified via video call about her family's support for David's guardianship and her commitment to providing backup assistance when needed. Sophie testified about feeling safe and loved and cared for in ways that made the courtroom understand that this was a child who knew the difference between legal guardianship and actual parenting. When it was David's turn to speak, he stood at the petitioner's table and looked at the judge who would decide whether his 18 months of improvised parenting qualified him. To make it official, "Your Honor," he said, "I know I'm young. I know I made decisions that weren't technically legal, but I also know that Sophie and I have been a family for 18 months, and we've been a good family. We take care of each other. We solve problems together. We've built a life that works." "Mr. Martinez," Judge Walsh said, "what would you say to people who argue that children need adult supervision, not teenage supervision?" "I would say that supervision isn't about age, it's about responsibility. And I would say that love isn't about legal status, it's about showing up every day and making sure the person you love is safe and happy and has everything they need to grow up healthy." Judge Walsh reviewed the case file for several minutes that felt like hours. When she looked up, her expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to something warmer. "Mr. Martinez, the court finds that you have demonstrated exceptional maturity and competence in caring for your sister. While your methods were unconventional, the results speak for themselves. Sophie is thriving under your care, and this court is not in the business of separating families that function well simply because they don't follow traditional structures." David felt Sophie's hand slip into his and squeeze with the excitement of someone who had just learned that her family was permanent. "I hereby grant David Martinez legal guardianship of Sophie Martinez, effective immediately, with continued supervision from Child Protective Services until David reaches the age of majority in 6 weeks. 6 months later, their apartment was officially theirs. David had negotiated a lease extension with improvements, using his new legal status as Sophie's guardian to advocate for better housing conditions. Sophie had started 4th grade with the confidence of someone who knew her address wouldn't change unexpectedly. David graduated high school a semester early and started community college, part-time, studying social work with the goal of helping other families navigate systems that weren't designed for unconventional situations. Sophie joined the school's math team and discovered she'd inherited their mother's talent for numbers, though she used hers for solving competition problems rather than calculating household expenses. On the anniversary of the night their apartment flooded, David taught Sophie how to solder copper pipe because practical skills were better than theoretical knowledge when your life required improvisation. She was a quick learner, inheriting his steady hands and his belief that most problems could be solved with the right tools and enough patience. "What if it floods again?" Sophie asked, testing the joint they'd created together. "Then we'll fix it again. Together? Together." They stood in their basement apartment, surrounded by the evidence of a year of successful independence. Sophie's artwork on the walls, David's college textbooks on the counter, photo strips from their first official family vacation to visit Aunt Maria in Colorado. The apartment still smelled faintly of the dehumidifier that ran constantly, but it smelled more strongly of home. Water had taught them its language, the sound of problems that needed immediate attention, the weight of responsibility that couldn't be carried alone, and the quiet satisfaction of repairs that held under pressure. But they had taught water something too, that some foundations were stronger than they looked, and that family was the kind of structure that could withstand flooding and still provide shelter. David looked at Sophie, who was examining their pipe repair with the pride of someone who had learned that competence was more valuable than perfection, and realized that the weight of water was nothing compared to the weight of love, and that both were easier to carry when you had help. "Sophie," he said, "are you ready for dinner? What are we having?" "Whatever's in the refrigerator plus whatever we can improvise." "My favorite kind of meal," They climbed the stairs from their basement apartment to their ground floor lives, leaving behind the tools and the evidence of another successful repair, carrying with them the knowledge that they could handle whatever problems tomorrow might bring, as long as they brought them together.